طيب بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله ومن والاه. Of course, everybody is following what's going on in Palestine at the moment. It's very painful. And the price incurred by the Palestinians is quite huge. Probably once this is ended, we'll have a toll that may exceed every toll that preceded it, probably the sum of all casualties throughout the struggle. And there is a clear reason for this. And the reason is that the Zionist project and those who created it and keep maintaining it are panicking that this project is proving to be so fragile, so vulnerable, that a few fighters emerging out of a besieged Gaza that had been under tight siege for 17 years managed to shake the foundations of this project. I remember that on the 7th of October, I read a couple of articles written by historians of warfare who said that what happened that day reminded them of something called the Tet Offensive that happened in Vietnam in 1968. And the resemblances were primarily two aspects. First, that like the Tet Offensive, the 7th of October attack was a surprise attack. It took everybody by surprise. It shook the entire world. The second aspect is that it was a turning point in the course of the struggle. Just as the Tet Offensive was a turning point in the struggle of the Vietnamese people for freedom, just as the Tet Offensive ended or began the process of ending the American presence in Vietnam, the 7th of October offensive is seen as the beginning of the end of the Zionist project. Now, the Zionist project is not much different from previous colonial projects. In essence, it is actually a colonial project because it was never a communal dispute between people of the region until the Zionists started coming to Palestine and seizing the land and planning to dispossess the Palestinians. Relations between the Muslims and the Jews throughout the Muslim world was amicable. Jews for centuries lived with the Muslims in peace and tranquility. Actually, Zionism did not start in the surroundings of Palestine. Zionism did not start among the Jews who had been living in the Middle East or in the Muslim world for centuries. It started in Europe. It started in Europe as a reaction to a European problem that seemed to be unresolvable. For many centuries, the Europeans had a problem with their Jews, and they discriminated against them, they treated them badly. And they also believed, especially the evangelicals among them, the Protestants, they believed that the sole role of the Jews in the kingdom of God is to go back to Palestine, to the Holy Land, to pave the way for the coming of the Messiah. In fact, until the latter quarter of the 19th century, Zionism was a Christian phenomenon, not a Jewish phenomenon. It was widespread among Christians who followed the tradition of Martin Luther and Calvin, the founders of the Protestant sect, who believed that the Messiah could not come back until all the Jews were sent back to Palestine. Yet the pogroms in Russia from the middle of the 19th century onwards, and then followed by the Dreyfus affair in France, followed by the Holocaust, the rise of the Nazis and the Holocaust, all of this paved the way for the espousing by a number of Jews of the idea of Zionism. Yet unlike Christian Zionism, which was a religious idea, Jewish Zionism was a secular idea. There's a brilliant book by John Rose called The Myths of Zionism, in which he shows that the founding fathers of Zionism and the founding fathers of Israel were actually all secular atheists. They didn't believe in the Torah, they didn't believe in Allah, they didn't believe in Moses, but they used the Torah or the Bible in order to justify stealing the land from the Palestinians and perpetrating all sorts of crimes against them. There is another book which I also usually strongly recommend. It's by Michael Pryor. It's called The Bible and Colonialism. And he shows how throughout history, the Bible was always used to justify colonial projects, the invasion of other people's countries. He starts, for instance, with what the white man of Europe did to the Americas, and then what the white man of Europe did to South Africa, the apartheid regime, and then eventually what the Zionists who came from Europe did to the Palestinians. So in fact, it is important for Muslims to understand that this is not a conflict between the Muslims and the Jews. Far from it. I know that many Muslims have come under the influence of a fake document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was actually created by the Russian Christian Orthodoxy in order to blame the Jews for the likelihood of a revolution erupting in Russia at the time against the Tsar. Regrettably, that document, which was originally written in Russian, was translated then to French, to English, and then to Arabic, probably to other languages. And it portrays the Jews as people who are so evil that they were intent on destroying civilization, on corrupting other people, etc. This was designed to convince people that the Jews had a global conspiracy and that they were intent on damaging their lives. Now, if we want to explain the conflict in Palestine, we have to explain it on the basis of facts, not fake documents, not on the basis of any unconfirmed reports or stories like sometimes you encounter in the social media nowadays because of the impossibility of checking the authenticity of what people sometimes throw into the social media. Or else, how do we explain that until about 5 or 7 years after the creation of the State of Israel, most Jews in the Arab region remained in the countries they were in? The Jews of Iraq, the Jews of Egypt, the Jews of Syria, of Libya, of Morocco, of Lebanon, of Algeria, of Iran, of Yemen. Actually, there's another brilliant book I would strongly recommend, just recently published by Professor Avi Shlaim, who is an Oxford University professor and one of the new historians, formerly in Israel, and now he deserted Israel and he lives in Oxford, and is becoming he's becoming increasingly critical of Zionism. He wrote a book about his own life story, his memoirs. He called it 3 Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew. So Avi Shlaim was born in Iraq. He is a descendant of one of the most ancient Jewish communities in the world, going all the way back to Bible, to the times of Babylon. And he explains that they were driven out of Iraq against their will. And it is confirmed now, even from Zionist archives, because this is what he discovered actually as a historian. He went to the archives and dug this information out, that it was the Zionist movement that orchestrated attacks on Jewish synagogues in Iraq, as they did also in Egypt, to convince the Jews who were living there happily and peacefully and in full harmony with the Muslims and the Christians of those countries, that those countries were no longer safe for them, because Israel, after its creation in 1948, needed a population. They needed to bring people. And by the way, most of the Jews until the Holocaust were opposed to Zionism. And this is clearly explained in another book by Israel Shahak, another Israeli historian. The book is entitled Jewish Fundamentalism in Israel. When Theodor Herzl, for instance, convened his first Zionist conference in Basel in 1897, the elders of the Jewish communities in Northern America held a congress, organized a congress in Montreal in Canada to denounce Herzl and to condemn Zionism and to dissociate themselves from what they believed at the time was an anti-Semitic project. So you see, the Jews 100 years ago associated Zionism with anti-Semitism. Unlike what is happening today, that the Zionists are trying to pressure the world to associate the criticism of Zionism with anti-Semitism. So what is this project then? It is a colonial project that is very much related to the developments that were happening in Europe and later on happened in the Arab region. Okay, in Europe, as I explained earlier, it was the rise of anti-Semitism, hating the Jews. The Christians were hating the Jews, they didn't like them, and they wanted to get rid of them. But something more important happened as early as the first years of the 20th century. As a result of the pogroms against the Jews in Russia, an increasing number of Russian Jews and Eastern European Jews were migrating to Western Europe. And Western European governments, especially in Britain and France, didn't want these Jews to come to them. So they wanted to close the borders. And Balfour, Arthur Balfour, the same guy who in 1917 issued the Balfour Declaration, was in 1905 the Prime Minister of Britain, and he was responsible for the white paper, for the white paper that prohibited the Jews from migrating to Britain, and he was called an anti-Semite. He was accused of being anti-Semite. So the desire to prevent the Jews, a Jewish influx from Russia and Eastern Europe into Western Europe, consolidated this idea of sending the Jews to Palestine to pave the way for the coming of the Messiah, especially that at the time, the rulers of Britain in particular belonged to the Christian Zionist trend. Now, the development in the Arab region was the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War. When the Ottomans were defeated, the British and the French took over, and in other parts Russia took over, but in the Middle East, in what is known today as the Muslim world and as the Arab world, the French and the British divided the region between them, created these mini states. Prior to that, there were no such states. It was just one ummah, one country, no borders, and placed Palestine under the British mandate. And the British used that mandate in order to encourage and facilitate Zionist immigration into Palestine. So the downfall of the Ottoman Empire was a very important landmark in this development. And of course, the victors in the war who defeated the Ottoman Empire wanted to make sure that the Muslims would never stand on their feet again. How do you do that? You divide them into artificial entities that are useless, that are failing, that are controlled by despotic, corrupt elite, and you create right in the heart amongst them a foreign entity that acts like a dagger, a military outpost that is like a dagger in the heart, keeping the body paralyzed, keeping it bleeding all the while. It cannot progress, it cannot develop, it cannot revive itself. So these are the real roots of the conflict that is still going on in Palestine until today. Now, what was the response of the Palestinians to this? Of course, they've been struggling. They've been struggling from day number one. I mean, my grandparents, my maternal grandparents were thrown out of their home in Bir al-Saba. My paternal grandparents were part of the resistance. My father was part of the resistance. So generation after generation, the Palestinians never stopped resisting, because as far as they were concerned, it was blatant theft of their land. In 1948, there was the Nakba. Now the Israelis are threatening us of a second Nakba, though actually there have been a series of Nakbas, not just one Nakba. 1948 was a Nakba when they created Israel on our land. 1967 was a Nakba when they took the rest of Palestine and on top took the Golan Heights and Sinai, which of course later on they returned to Egypt as part of the Camp David peace treaty with the Egyptians. 1993 was the biggest Nakba in my opinion, because that was the time when the PLO, which was supposed to liberate Palestine, was turned into a Palestinian authority that is no more than a collaborative agency working for the Israelis, whose primary objective is to control the Palestinians and provide security for Jewish settlers and Israeli troops that roam freely in the 1967 occupied territories. Now, of course, like every other people in the world, you resist, and it doesn't matter that they call you a terrorist. We shouldn't really be intimidated by the word terrorist. We've seen Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years of his youthful life in prison because he was struggling for the liberation and the dignity of his people. He was called a terrorist. Even Margaret Thatcher called him a terrorist. And she vowed that he'd never be allowed to set foot in Britain. He and his people succeeded in bringing down apartheid. He arrived in the United Kingdom and was given a hero's welcome. And everybody now is proud of talking about Nelson Mandela, let alone associating with him if they were ever associated. The Vietnamese people were called terrorists, yet they eventually succeeded in driving the Americans out and achieving their sovereignty and independence. The Algerian people lived under French colonialism for 130 years. And the French colonialism is the closest thing to what we see today in Palestine, because it was a settler colonial replacement form of colonialism. They annexed Algeria. Imagine Algeria, which is so big in area. It was annexed to France. It became part of France. And the French thought that nobody could ever drive them out of it. Imagine 130 years. They imposed their language on the Algerian people. They imposed their culture. They even tried to impose their own religion. No less than 10 to 15 million Algerians were killed by the French during the War of Independence. Eventually, the Algerians gained their independence and freedom. Eventually, Palestine will be free. Definitely, there is no question about it. If you look at the history of colonialism, there are three models that we see among them. First, there is the model of what happened in America, New Zealand, and Australia, when the indigenous population was finished off, and the incoming invaders managed to re-establish a country of their own, with their own culture, their own language, their own religion, and the indigenous population became a very marginal component of society. The second model was the model of Vietnam and Algeria, when the colonial powers were defeated and the colonialists were driven back to wherever they came from. The third model is the one we saw in South Africa, where the South African apartheid authorities came to Nelson Mandela in his prison cell and said to him, come on, Nelson, we want an end to this. This cannot continue like this. He said to them, very easy, declare apartheid to be null and void, and we can live together. The problem in South Africa wasn't that there were whites and blacks and Indians and colored, whatever. It was the fact that the white minority rule discriminated among people according to the color of their skin. So you have the whites on top, followed by the Indians, followed by the colored, followed by the blacks, who happened to be the majority. Yet they were treated as the lowest class in their own country. And eventually, when apartheid was untenable, it couldn't continue anymore, it just came to an end, and the whole system changed, and now the whites and the blacks and the coloreds and the Indians, everybody is living in South Africa, at least in theory and under the law, they're supposed to be equal citizens. Now, how it will end in Palestine, we don't know yet, except for the fact that it cannot be the first model. It's impossible. They cannot finish the Palestinians. Palestinians will continue to struggle. They've tried to finish them over the past 75 years in a variety of ways, and the Palestinians to continue to increase in number and to increase in their steadfastness and in their determination to struggle for their freedom. But there is also another important factor here. This is not an issue for the Palestinians alone. This is not the question of Palestine. Palestine in particular, unlike any other cause, is a Muslim cause, is a pan-Islamic cause, for two important reasons. First, for its place in the Islamic faith. Al-Masjid al-Aqsa is our first Qibla, is our third holiest place on the face of the earth, and it is the location from which the Prophet ﷺ was lifted or ascended to the upper heavens, Laylatul Mi'raj. And one may wonder, I mean, if it was only a Mi'raj that was important, why didn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do the Mi'raj for him from Mecca directly? And we know that in the hadith that Al-Baytul Ma'mur, to which Rasulullah was ascended, or close to which he was ascended, is exactly above Mecca al-Mukarramah, above Al-Bayt al-Haram. So why take him to Bayt al-Maqdis? And why assemble all the prophets of Allah during that night for Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam to lead them in salat, to lead them in prayer? The symbolism of this, the significance of this, is the partnership in faith between Mecca and Al-Quds. That this is the land of Islam, and as Islam started from Mecca and spread in Arabia, Islam will look upon the world from Bayt al-Maqdis whenever Bayt al-Maqdis is free. So it matters to the Muslims, to the Pakistanis, it matters to the Malaysians, to the Indonesians, to the newly convert Muslims, to the Arabs, to the Africans, to the Asians, whenever you say La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, immediately Palestine, Bayt al-Maqdis becomes of importance to you because it's part of your faith. The Surah Al-Isra is there to remind us of this fact, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserves that surah as he took it upon himself to preserve the book as a whole. Inna nahnu nazzalna dhikra wa inna lahu lahafidhun. Now the second reason is that the very incentive for creating the state of Israel in Palestine was actually to hinder the revival of Islam in the world. And look what Israel is doing at the moment. Israel is sabotaging Islam everywhere, is fighting Islam in collaboration with the corrupt, despotic rulers of the Muslim countries. They collaborate together with the Zionists in order to prevent the return of Islam to our lives. The European powers that insisted on having a Jewish homeland in Palestine actually went against the wishes of some of the pioneers of Zionism. Theodor Herzl, for instance, was of the opinion that Palestine was not the best place for a Jewish homeland. He preferred it to be Argentina or probably Libya. He went to see the king of Italy, which was colonizing Libya, and begged him to give the Zionist Libya to become a Jewish homeland. He tried for Cyprus with the British. He tried Uganda, etc. It was the British and their partners who defeated the Ottoman Empire that eyed Palestine as the place where such a Jewish homeland should be established, to use the Zionists as a functional community working for the colonial powers. This is how it started. So for us, it is an Islamic issue because the purpose of the creation of Israel in Palestine is to hinder the progress of the Muslims, to hinder their revival, to hinder the return of Islam to their lives. Now, how can we, and I'd like to conclude with this to give you some an opportunity to interact. How can we, around the world, whether we are Muslim or whether we are the supporters of truth and justice in Palestine, how can we help the Palestinians in their plight? Well, first of all, as a Muslim, keep making dua. Dua is very powerful. Just make dua in your prayers. Make dua whenever you remember your brothers and sisters and what's happening to them. Make dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provide them with a relief out of this hardship and difficulty, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provide them with victory against their enemies. Second, we need to enlighten public opinion about the truth of what's going on in Palestine, about the historical facts, as well as about the realities. And for this, you need to educate oneself. We need to educate ourselves. If we don't have the knowledge, how can we convey it to others? How can we convince others of the justness and the truthfulness of this struggle? And you can see nowadays, as a result of what is happening in Palestine, in Gaza, and despite the very high cost in terms of lives, in terms of life itself, that the world is curious. The world is interested in knowing, why is this happening? Why are the Israelis doing this to the Palestinians? Why did Hamas do what it did on the 7th of October? People are asking questions. People want to know. There is thirst, there is hunger for more information. We need to equip ourselves with the knowledge to do this. And I mentioned to you a number of books that are useful in this regard. The Myths of Zionism by John Rose, The Bible and Colonialism by Michael Pryor, Three Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew by Avi Shlaim, and Avi Shlaim has several other books on the conflict. Also the books by Elan Pape, another new historian who also migrated from Israel because he's considered to be an anti-Zionist now, and he lectures at Exeter University here in the UK. Yes, I will provide you with the list of the books, inshallah. There's also my book, which has been translated into several languages. It was published first in English. In the UK edition, it's called Hamas Unwritten Chapters. In the American edition, it's called Hamas: A History from Within. It was translated into Turkish, into Malay, and I was told it was translated into Russian, but I'm not sure if it is available in any other language. In this book of mine, in the first chapter, I tell the story of Palestine, of course, briefly. And then I tell the story of Hamas, how it was born and how it grew up to be what it is. In the third chapter, I talk about their tactics from the Intifada to the military wing, Azz-Din Qassam. And then there are several other chapters that deal with the different aspects. Those who can read Arabic, some of the best sources on the conflict are those written by Professor Abdul Wahab El-Misiri, rahimahullah. He authored an 8-volume encyclopedia called in Arabic Al-Yahud wal-Yahudiyya wa-Suhuyuniyya, Jews, Judaism, and Zionism. But he has a book, he has several books in English, but one of them is called Palestine, the Land of Promise. But I think it's out of print. I'm not sure if it has a PDF copy online or not. You can always check this. I'll send you the titles anyway. There is an abundance of books, actually. But you need to look for those that are authoritative, those that are supported by evidence, and not those that are based on rumor or wishful thinking or fake documents. Be careful what you're reading and where you derive your information from. There's a good book in English also by Henry Cottan, C-O-T-T-A-N. It's called The Question of Palestine. It also tells the story of the Nakba and what happened to Palestine since the turn of the 20th century. There's a lot really to talk about with regard to what's going on at the moment, but it's probably better to stop here and give you an opportunity to interact with what I have said. Thank you very much.
Jazakallah, Ustaz. Just a quick question. Like, what is the current situation? What is the current situation of the resistance movement in Palestine? Could you kindly elaborate and explain? Of course, you are in Britain, so just keeping in mind that you don't put yourself in danger or in any kind of difficulty.
Well, what we know really about the resistance today is what the resistance tell us about themselves, because there are no other sources. I mean, there are no journalists in the battlefront. And occasionally the resistance release videos, which are available on YouTube of some of their operations. They say they are determined to continue resisting and fighting the invading Zionist forces. Actually, the Zionists bombarded Gaza so heavily, so intensely, because they wanted to crush the resistance and guarantee for themselves a safe entry into the Strip. Clearly, it's not that safe, and we hear every day of daring operations by the resistance. I don't have any further information apart from this, I regret.
Jazakallah khair, Ustaz. Now, inshallah, we'll open the floor for questions. Of course, I cannot promise to answer and to take all the questions and to entertain all the questions. But inshallah, on first come, first served basis, if you could just jot down your questions in the chat box, and then I'll read it out loud to Ustaz, inshallah. Ustaz, there's a question from a brother, and he's asking what led to this situation in Palestine. A little bit of background.
Well, what led to this situation is the continuation of occupation. Palestine has been under Zionist occupation for 75 years. Throughout the 75 years, they've kept taking the land and taking the resources, treating the Palestinians as scum, people who have no dignity, who have no respect, who have no value whatsoever. I mean, can you imagine that in the old Israeli law, if a Jew killed a Palestinian, they'd pay only 1 penny as a penalty, and whereas if a Palestinian kills an Israeli, they go for life to prison. There are two types of Palestinians now inside Palestine, the whole of Palestine. There are those that remained from 1948 in what became Israel, and they are known as, the Israelis call them the Israeli Arabs. We call them the Palestinians of 1948. They are Israeli citizens, officially speaking, but they are treated as second class, if not third class citizens. There's a system of apartheid. And this was exposed by 3 major human rights organizations. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organization, who called the Israeli system of governance an apartheid regime. Now, Gaza in particular, it's been under siege since 2006, since Hamas won the elections in 2006. 17 years under siege. The Israelis control when they can have water, when they cannot, when they can have electricity, when they cannot, when they can have milk for their children, when they cannot, when they can come out or not. It's the biggest prison on the face of the earth. Actually, the Israelis who claim that the state of Israel is a compensation for the Jews for what happened to them in the Holocaust, actually perpetrating the same crimes that were committed against the Jews and against other minorities in Germany during the Holocaust. This is a concentration camp. Gaza was turned by the Zionists into a huge concentration camp. And the peace process promised by the world and by Israel and by other parties in the region has produced nothing but an authority in Ramallah that works for the Israelis, that is partner to the Israelis in subjugating and persecuting the Palestinians. So there's no way out. They're keeping these people under pressure. They put them in a pressure cooker, literally speaking. Eventually, the pressure cooker just explodes. And what we saw on the 7th of October is a reaction to sustained action by the Zionists, in which they keep humiliating and dehumanizing the Palestinians.
Indeed, Ustaz. Ustaz, there is this question about misinformation doing rounds that Israel actually created Hamas. How to tackle this question? Would you like to address this question, or would you like to just pass this?
Well, this is, unfortunately, this has been said several times and sometimes by people who are, I'd say, famous in the social media, regrettably. And this is a very silly statement to say. I mean, why would Israel create its own nemesis, its own arch enemy? Why would Israel create Hamas in 1987 and then a few months later arrest all the leadership, including Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, most of the founders of the movement, including him, put them in prison and start assassinating members of the movement, and 2 years later or 3 years later, deporting to South Lebanon 400 of them? I mean, I regret to say that some people have picked up this silly claim from the PLO, because the PLO, which was paving the way for peace talks with the Americans and the Israelis in the late 80s, was taken by surprise with the eruption of the Intifada in December 1987, and what accompanied the Intifada of the birth of Hamas. And I explain this in detail in my book, Hamas Unwritten Chapters. So Yasser Arafat at the time accused the Israelis not only of igniting the Intifada, but also of creating Hamas, because Hamas seemed to offer itself as an alternative to a decadent PLO. And some people who are still supportive of the PLO and its quest for a two-state solution keep repeating this: oh, Israel is to blame because Israel created Hamas. I mean, how silly. This is a very silly argument. People who know the history of Hamas and the history of the struggle would never reiterate something as silly as this.
Sure, Ustaz. Now, the next question is economic boycott helpful, and are movements like BDS making any difference? What do you think?
Of course, it's very important. It's very, very useful and very important. The Israelis get mad because of the boycott, and they're trying to push for incriminating BDS around the world. And actually, in America, some people do not deal with anyone who boycotts Israel, and there is a push now in Britain and Parliament to come up with a law that prohibits boycotting Israel. But of course, boycotting has to be done properly. I can see that in the social media, some people are just listing hundreds on top of hundreds of companies. This is not the way to do it. You can't ask people to boycott everything. It becomes impractical. It doesn't work. You need to focus. We need to follow guidelines from enlightened people, from knowledgeable people, as to what actually hurts occupation. Primarily, it's companies that produce products in the Jewish settlements, or companies that provide Jewish settlements with raw materials or with investments. This primarily is what we target, and then target companies that publicly support Zionism. I mean, we saw, for instance, McDonald's and what they did. They should really be boycotted for what they did to learn a lesson. They immediately came out in support of what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. As I said, boycott is important. It drives them mad, and but it has to be clever. It has to be tactical. It needs to be coordinated in order to really be painful for them.
Thank you, Ustaz. Now moving on to the next question. How was Hamas created?
Well, Hamas came into existence on the 9th of December 1987. What was it before? It was Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun of Palestine. You know, the Muslim Brotherhood, or Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun, which were set up or started by Hassan al-Banna, rahimahullah, in Egypt in 1928. By the mid-40s, started spreading across the region and setting up chapters. So they had a Palestinian chapter, a Jordanian chapter, a Syrian chapter, a Lebanese one, an Iraqi one. They were spreading in the region. Now the Palestinian movement of the Ikhwan al-Muslimun joined the resistance in 1948 and joined the volunteers who came from Egypt, the Ikhwan who came from Egypt to fight against Zionism and prevent the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. But after the treason committed by the Arab governments of the time that enabled the Zionists to seize Palestine and create their own state, the Ikhwan came to the conclusion in Palestine that the priority now should not be for direct confrontation with the occupation, but rather for tarbiyah, for education, for training people to be good Muslims, because if we reform the individual and reform the family, then we can reform society, the whole community, and then hopefully we can bring about the change that enables us to liberate Palestine. And this remained the dominant thinking until the late 80s. We're talking about 1987, when things were getting really very bad, because those of you probably who do not know the details of history, 1948 was the occupation of 2/3 of Palestine. 1967 was the occupation of the rest of Palestine. So by 1987, about 20 years after the occupation of the West Bank in 1967, the situation was getting really bad. More land was being snatched by the Zionists, more settlements built, more detainees in prison, more killings, crops were being destroyed, olive trees were being burnt by the settlers. And then the Intifada erupted, a reaction to a crime committed on the 8th of December when an Israeli truck driver massacred 7 Palestinian workers who were returning from work. So the people erupted in anger, which is called Intifada or uprising, and the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood met that night, or the following night, sorry, on the 9th of December, 1987, and decided we cannot just be content with what we are doing. Yes, we continue what we are doing, but we have to join the people in their expression of anger, in their intifada. So initially, the Muslim Brotherhood declared the creation of Hamas, which is the acronym for the name in Arabic, Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, Hamas. And the tactics used by this resistance movement started with really very simple means of just organizing rallies and calling for strikes, probably throwing stones at Israeli army troops when they came into Palestinian neighborhoods, but then later developed into using knives to attack Israeli soldiers in the occupied territories, followed by snatching rifles and guns from these soldiers, using them to take soldiers as hostages, to exchange them for detainees, or to kill or Israeli attacking soldiers, and so on, depending on the progress of events. The movement developed its various tactics until now. We can see the sort of highly advanced tactics. Taking into consideration that they are under siege and under occupation, that they used on the 7th of December. Of course, it wasn't an easy journey. Many of the leaders of the movement were assassinated. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, Abdulaziz Rantisi, Salah Shahada, Ibrahim Maqadma, Ahmed Al-Jabari, so many people, and let alone the ordinary members, who many of whom perished either resisting the Israelis or being assassinated by them, or being held in prison cells in Israeli dungeons.
Our next question is, what is the role of the normalization process in the MEA region, Middle East region, in creating the current unrest?
I'm sure that this quest for normalization had something to do with this, because the Palestinians felt that they were being let down by the Arabs. I'm not talking about the Arab peoples, because the Arab peoples as a whole continue to reject normalization. I'm talking about governments. These governments were going behind the back of the Palestinians and concluding normalization deals with Israel. And you know what these normalization deals do? They open Arab airspace to Israeli aviation. They open Arab markets to Israeli products, especially high-tech products, sometimes weaponry. And while Israel is not interested anymore in giving the Palestinians any of their rights back, so the Israelis become more defiant. They say, okay, we don't need the Palestinians. Now the Arabs are making peace with us. Now we can go to Abu Dhabi, we can go to Dubai, we can go to Cairo, we can go to Amman, we can go to anywhere in this region because of these normalization efforts. Why should we consider the Palestinians or consider giving them anything at all? Yes, as a result of normalization, life became a lot more difficult for the Palestinians. So yes, it is an important factor. Of course, it would seem now a lot more difficult for Arab regimes to pursue further normalization because of what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. This is going to be very embarrassing for anyone, especially the Saudi government, which almost signed a deal had it not been for the 7th of October attack. They were actually preparing for a signing ceremony with the Israelis.
Indeed, Ustaz. Ustaz, our next question is, are the people of West Bank with the people of Gaza?
Definitely, definitely. They know that what the people of Palestine as a whole are suffering is a shared concern. I mean, the Israelis have been doing this for Gaza and the West Bank for 75 years. It's not new. And since the Israelis started their offensive, this recent offensive on Gaza, the West Bank has not been restful, has been restless. Close to 200 people have so far been killed by the Israelis. Several hundreds have been detained since then. There are curfews, there are confrontations. But of course, the situation in the West Bank is a lot more difficult because of the existence of the Palestinian Authority led by Mahmoud Abbas. All they do is inform on the Palestinians, they exchange information, intelligence with the Israelis, and they use their own forces, which were trained by the Israelis and some of their allies, to crack down on the Palestinians of the West Bank.
Jazakallah khair, Ustaz. Jazakallah khair, Ustaz. It was an honor to have you. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect and preserve you. Inshallah. Jazakallah khair. May Allah
Thank you
subhanahu wa
very
ta'ala
much.
give
Thank you for having
victory to
me.
the people of Palestine, inshallah.
Thank you. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.